On a night at the Comedy Store on Sunset Boulevard in the early 1980s, Sam Kinison walked on stage and performed a set that nobody in the room had seen before and that most of them would not forget. George Carlin was standing near the back. He had not arrived early. He had not taken a seat at a table near the front. He had arrived in the way that performers arrive at shows where they are not performing. Quietly, without announcement, finding a position that allows them to watch without being watched. He was standing near the back of the room, in the particular informality of a man who has come to see something rather than to be seen seeing it. Kinison began. The set that followed was unlike anything that had been performed on that stage, or on most stages in American comedy at that moment. Not because of the specific material, which was already circulating in the underground of the comedy world and had been generating the particular kind of word of mouth that precedes a performer's recognition, but because of the quality of the performance itself. The specific intensity of a man who was not performing emotion, but was, in some way that was not easy to categorize, actually in it. The room responded immediately and completely. Not in the way that comedy rooms respond to jokes, the particular rhythm of setup and release that characterizes a well-constructed stand-up set. The response was different. More urgent, more surprised. The response of a room that is encountering something it had not known was going to happen. Carlin watched from the back. He stayed for the full show. He did not move from his position near the back of the room. He watched with the specific attention of a performer who is watching another performer in the way that requires concentration rather than relaxation. Afterward, in the parking lot of the Comedy Store, someone who had been with him that night asked what he had thought. Carlin said one sentence. It was not a review. It was not an assessment of technique or a comparison to other comedians Carlin had watched. It was something more specific than that, something that revealed, in a single sentence, what Carlin had been looking for when he watched Kinison that night. But to understand what the sentence meant, what it contained, requires understanding the specific thing Carlin was looking at when he watched Kinison perform. And that requires going back to the beginning of the set. The specific moment in Kinison's set that Carlin later referenced, the moment when the performance shifted from impressive to something more, came in the section of the material dealing with Kinison's own history. Kinison had material about his marriage, about his time in the church, about the specific arc of his own experience that had brought him from one life to a completely different one. This material was not the most obviously striking part of the set. It was not the scream, was not the ferocity, was not the moments that the audience later remembered most vividly when they described the performance to people who had not been there. But it was the most honest part of the set. And what Carlin recognized in those minutes, the specific minutes when Kinison was talking about what had actually happened to him, was the quality of feeling that separates the performance of truth from the actual thing. Kinison in those minutes was not building toward the scream. He was not constructing a comic arc. He was talking about his own life with the specific unguardedness of someone who has not yet figured out how to protect himself from what he is saying. Not a choice not to protect himself, not the deliberate courage of a performer who has decided to be vulnerable. The absence of protection that comes when the material is still too close, too real to have been sufficiently mediated by craft. This, Carlin understood, was the most dangerous and the most valuable thing about what Kinison was doing. The most dangerous because material that is this close, is also the most likely to become something else, to collapse into self-pity, or into performed emotion, or into the version that the audience wants, rather than the version that is actually true. The most valuable, because material that stays this close, that survives the pressure of performance without losing its connection to the original experience, is the material that reaches the audience in the specific way that only the real thing can reach them. Kinison's material stayed close. In those minutes, it did not collapse. It did not soften or redirect or protect itself by becoming something more manageable. It stayed in the place where it actually lived, and the room felt this, not as a comfortable thing, but as a real thing, which is a different category entirely. Carlin watched from the back. He watched Kinison. He watched the audience. He watched the specific exchange between the performer and the room in the minutes when the material was most honest. And then the set ended. The audience's response was immediate and sustained, not the measured appreciation of a good comedy performance, but the specific release of an audience that has been held at a particular tension and has just been allowed to exhale. Carlin walked out into the parking lot. Someone asked him what he had thought. He said the one sentence, and the sentence was this: "He's not pretending." Sam Kinison in the early 1980s was a performer who had arrived at the comedy world by an unusual route. He had been a Pentecostal preacher before he became a comedian, an aspect of his background that was not incidental to what he did on stage. The specific quality of his delivery, the specific register of his performance, bore a visible relationship to the tradition of religious oratory that he had come from. The scream was the thing that everybody noticed first. The sudden, wrenching shift in volume that punctuated his material, the moment when the voice went from conversational to the full-body sound of someone whose feeling had exceeded what ordinary speech could contain. It was, in its origin, not a comedy technique. It was the sound of the preacher at the moment of maximum emotional intensity, transferred to a comedy stage and aimed at a comedy audience. This transfer was the thing that made Kinison unlike anyone else working in stand-up at that time. The physical register of his performance, the weight, the volume, the commitment of the body as well as the voice, came from a tradition that had nothing to do with comedy, and that combination produced something that the comedy world had not seen in that form. The material was angry. This was understood by everyone who saw him perform, but the nature of the anger was what distinguished him from the comedians who used anger as a performed affect, as a comedic color applied to material that was, at its base, constructed from the same premises that other comedians constructed their material from. Kinison's anger was not applied, it was generated. It came from the actual experience of having believed something completely and then stopped believing it. The specific emotional fact of a man who had committed himself to a system of understanding and had found that system to be inadequate. The comedy was the aftermath of that recognition, and the aftermath was genuinely angry in the way that genuine disillusionment tends to produce genuine anger rather than the performed version. Carlin understood this distinction. He had spent years thinking about exactly this question, the difference between the comedic affect and the comedic reality, between the performed version of a feeling and the actual feeling that the performance was, at its best, a vehicle for. His own career had been built on this distinction. The transformation he had undertaken in the early 1970s, the movement away from the clean-cut television comedian toward the counterculture voice, had been, at its core, the decision to let the actual feeling drive the performance, rather than the performed version of the feeling. Watching Kinison from the back of the Comedy Store, Carlin was watching for exactly this. Not the technique, not the scream, which was visible to everyone in the room, but whether what was underneath the scream was real. By the midpoint of the set, he had his answer. And his answer was the thing that produced the sentence he said in the parking lot afterward.
He's not pretending.
This is the sentence that Carlin said in a parking lot outside the Comedy Store after watching Sam Kinison perform. 3 words. Not a review, not an analysis, not the professional assessment of a more experienced comedian evaluating a younger one's technique. 3 words that contained, in compressed form, the specific observation Carlin had been making for the entire duration of the set. The sentence is not an obvious compliment. He's not pretending does not mean he is good or he is talented, or any of the conventional evaluations that performers apply to other performers. It means something more specific and more important than any of those things. It means the thing he is performing is the real version of what he is performing. The emotion is the actual emotion. The anger is the actual anger. The history he is describing is the actual history. The performance is not a performance of a feeling that he is not feeling. It is the feeling, given form by performance. This distinction between the performer who is performing feeling and the performer who is actually feeling was one of the central preoccupations of Carlin's own creative life. He had spent years constructing a relationship with his material that allowed him to give the audience the real version rather than the performed version. He understood, from the inside, how difficult this was. How many mechanisms exist in the performer-audience relationship that encourage the safe version, the managed version, the version that protects both parties from the full weight of the actual thing. Watching Kinison, Carlin had seen a performer who was not using those mechanisms, who was bringing the actual feeling, specifically, particularly, in its full, unmanaged form, to the stage, and trusting that the room could hold it. The specific path that had brought Kinison to this was completely different from the path that had brought Carlin to it. Carlin had arrived at the real version through a long process of intellectual construction, through the careful dismantling of the safe forms and the gradual building of a comic style that was structurally honest rather than emotionally raw. Kinison had arrived at it through the specific emotional history of a man whose relationship with belief had been entirely restructured by experience. 2 completely different roads, the same destination. The destination is not pretending. The specific quality of the comedy that lasts, that reaches the audience in the way that matters, that is remembered not as a good night at a comedy club, but as something that was genuinely affecting, is almost always built from this destination. From material that is not pretending to be what it is. From a performer who is not pretending to feel what the performance requires feeling. Carlin had spent decades building toward this. He recognized it immediately in Kinison because he had been looking at it in himself for years. The 3 words were not a verdict, they were a recognition. 2 men, different stages in different rooms, different histories, different forms. But when Carlin said those 3 words in the parking lot of the Comedy Store, what he was saying was, I have seen someone else arrive at the same thing I have been trying to arrive at. by a completely different road. That is not a small thing to witness, and it is not a small thing to say. 3 words, not pretending,